Hello, here we are again. If you're new, let me welcome you. If you are a returning listener, what's up? This is Yoga Talks Podcast. My name is Jay Brown. It's nice to be here to sit down to try to talk to you for a minute before today's podcast. I am recording at an unusual time. Last 2 weeks, I was right up against the wire. I was scrambling to make this happen just in time to get it out to you. So this week, I was determined not to put myself in that position. First, I tried to just go back to my old routine, which is after I teach my Friday night class, I sit and do a little recording for the podcast next week. But last night when I went to do it, it didn't work. Like, I was just too spent and too tired. And like, I sat down and I hit record and I started talking and it just sucked. Wasn't good. And I have to say, that has never happened before. In the 2 years that I've been doing this podcast, I've never had it happen where I sit down to record for the podcast and I don't succeed in recording, and I just end up giving up, which is what happened. I tried once or twice, and then it just felt wrong. It wasn't good. I was rambling, and it felt incoherent. And then I said, well, let me try one more time. And then the third time, I felt like it was better, and I was like, okay, that'll work. But it turned out I forgot to hit the record button right, and I didn't even record it. And I was like, oh, that's it. Fuck it. I'm done. And I just left, and because I had to drive home. You see, this is what's been happening, you guys. Now that the tumult of my move is done, those of you who don't know, I recently moved after 15 years of living in Brooklyn. I moved to Easton, Pennsylvania. And now that the tumult of the move is done, and we're kind of there, and we're slowly getting things in place, it's kind of coming together, what I've realized is that I didn't lessen any of my workload at all. So I'm still teaching just as many classes, putting out just as many blog posts and podcasts, doing the teacher trainings that I'm doing. All the workload that I had is remained the same. The only thing that's changed is I no longer live a 1.5-minute walk around away from the center. I now have added anywhere from like 15 to 20 hours of commute time to my work week. So I have less time than I had before. And gosh, I don't know. I mean, I can do it for a time, but not for long. There's no way I'm going to be able to maintain this new commute. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought, I'll just commute. It'll be fine. I didn't really figure in just the time factor. So it's Saturday, and I'm in a reasonably good mood. Hopefully this is going good for you. I feel like it's going good for me. I just completed like many hours of teaching. I taught a regular class and then did like a 3-hour teacher training session. So I'm just rolling off of that. I was like, let's get this done because I don't want to wait till tomorrow and be up against it again. But here's what I'm really thinking about. And I'm curious, those of you who are out there, how you feel about this or what you think about this. I'm remembering that there was times in my life where I could just let a day go by, like just let a day unfold however it unfolds and kind of waste a day, just watch TV until 2 p.m. and then, just there were times in my life where I did that, and I cannot remember the last time. I mean, years and years, there has not been a day where I just let the day unfold however it wanted to unfold. And I'm wondering, do any of us do that? I'm sure maybe there's some people out there, maybe people who don't live in big cities, who have like a more rural existence. I don't know. That it's just too scheduled, too jam-packed. It's like today, I had like an hour and a half before I had to leave. So I went to Lowe's Home Improvement Center to get the venting materials for the dryer because we got to get the dryer vented so we can wash clothes because we're running out of laundry. And, you know, places like Lowe's or like IKEA, they are these time warps, you know. You go in there and just like, next thing you know, you're in another dimension. And then I just screwed myself. I didn't have time. I didn't get stuff done. I had to rush to get here. I'm just dropping details left and right. You know, yesterday, the 7 a.m. class in the morning was canceled, and I just spaced it. I forgot to update the website and put a note on the door, so there were people here and leaving nasty voicemails, how upset they were because they came to class and there was no class. And it was totally my fault. They just screwed up. So I'm dropping details. I'm overwhelmed by time. And really, I think I'm just starting to realize that my time here in this place that I created, that I've so benefited from and enjoyed the cocoon aspect of for the better part of a decade, it's starting to come to a close, you know? Like I can see it. It's not that many more weeks that I will actually still be here doing this the way I have been. And I'm not exactly clear about what's next. I've got some things in the works, but I don't know. I have not done that yet. It's a new territory, a new routines that I'll be getting into that are unformed as of now. And the result of that is me feeling quite a bit scattershot. I will say that it's an irony and also makes sense that as I am more scattershot, navigating all of these movable parts and new territories, my personal practice and my teaching is like rock solid. I just feel like it needs to be solid. You know, it's like a touchstone. And I had a wonderful thing happen this evening where a student who used to come to the center regular, like that, 3 or 4 days a week person who just knows all the teachers and is really a staple participant at the center, she had a very random and scary stroke and lost her ability to like walk and talk. And we raised money to help her for that first year because she couldn't work while she was trying to recover. And she has recovered. She showed up here today and came and took class with me. And she was just saying how great it was that there was this consistency that she could come back to again. And I always think that if you can establish a really solid practice that changes with you and serves your needs, it never goes away. Like even if you choose not to practice, even if your life gets kind of crazy and you become scattershot and you don't practice for a while or whatever, whenever you decide to do it, it is there. It doesn't go anywhere. It's always right there. So, I don't know if this would mean anything to anybody, if it's just me spouting off, but it's a strange swirl that I'm in, and I'm betting I'm not the only one. I have a feeling that there's a swirl happening in general. And, you know, we haven't talked about, like, the politics lately. You know, some of you who listened in the past, you know, I was mentioning stuff as it was going on, and I'm kind of, like, not focused on it. I've been paying attention, but it just seems like, wow, there's a feeling of unraveling, you know? And in some sense, that is very scary. Oh, gosh, wow. I was talking about how last night I was just rambling on and being incoherent, and I am afraid that I might have just done that again. So let's get to today's podcast. And actually, it's not a bad segue because I'm talking about the realities of being this independent yoga teacher who's having to navigate my career, as many of you listening are, I'm sure. And today's podcast is coming out of an article that happened in Yoga Journal not too long ago, some weeks back, and it was talking about a new model for yoga centers, and it was featuring Down Under Yoga in Boston, which is an institution in Boston. Anybody who's from Boston knows Down Under Yoga. They've been around for a very long time. A lot of really renowned teachers have made a home there. And Down Under Yoga recently announced that they were going to switch their teachers over from being independent contractors to employees. And as I mentioned last week, I posted out the article on my Facebook timeline with a kind of snarky comment, basically saying, I don't think this is the whole story, because they just painted it in this really black and white way of like, oh, look at this. Yoga teachers are going to be employees and they're going to get benefits and they're going to have more job security and stuff. And I'm like, really? I don't know. So it's an interesting conversation, not just like the questions of like, do you write off deductions or mandatory unpaid staff meetings, or do you get to set your own schedule, which we talk about in the talk today with Justine. But it's also just kind of, for me, the idea of it. Like, there is a difference when what you do is like an independently run business, or whether you are an employee of someone else. And I think that's always been the sticky point, is like, are we employees or are we our own bosses? Sometimes when you teach at centers, I'm sure some of you know, it doesn't feel like you get to call your own shots. And actually next week, I'll tell you about it on the other side, but I've got a yoga teacher coming on who's going to talk about that with us, about her experiences of dealing with yoga center owners. So this week, we're going to talk to the yoga center owner. But next week, we're going to talk to one of the teachers who has to deal with the yoga center owners. So just so many layers to this particular question about whether or not a yoga teacher is an independent operator or whether or not a yoga teacher works for someone else. So it was a cool thing that when I posted it out on my Facebook timeline, Justine from Down Under, the owner, and also her partner, they both jumped on and made a comment. And it was smart because they were defending their position and wanted to make sure that the record was straight and that there wasn't like some story line out there that was not true. And I really respect that. And so I immediately invited her to come on the podcast to talk with me. And that's what we're going to listen to today. We don't just talk about the employee independent contractor issue. I also just probe her because I'm curious about somebody who runs a yoga center for over a decade and then starts opening up several locations. She's got a number of locations. She's growing and expanding. And I've talked about how, independently owned centers, they have to grow in order to survive. And that's kind of the issue. Well, Justine is just playing the game. She's growing to survive. And, we get into it. We get into whether and why people think of Down Under as being corporate when it's an independently owned thing. So, cool stuff. We'll listen to it today. Before we do, let me mention some gigs. I'm going to be in Helsinki, Finland, August 23rd through 30th. I'm going to be in Japan again at the end of September, but that's pretty far in advance, so you can check future dates. Got some stuff coming up. I'm booking a bunch of travel, especially starting in 2018. I've got my live stream stuff. That's been really fun the last 2 weeks now. We've been having it. And those of you who are listening, doing live stream, very cool to be having practice with you. all of my public classes are now available to anybody, anywhere, via my live stream subscription. Some of you guys have been asking me, like, what's going to happen in the future? Well, I'm going to announce it, but I'm going to continue teaching public classes, if not here in Brooklyn, at other places. And I'm kind of negotiating it into the situation to keep the live stream going. I'm also going to be looking at maybe changing the schedule a little bit. You know, if you looked at the schedule, and you're like, oh, I'd love to do it, but I can't do any of these times. Hey, man, hit me up with an email. Let me know what your ideal times were. We're going to make some changes there. So very cool. Live stream subscription. Also, of course, you can listen to the archives of this podcast. If you haven't gone back into it, there's some pretty good stuff from earlier times you might check out. And also my blog, last week's blog, got a lot of response. You can check that out, along with my other video projects, the DVD and downloads, and the online workshop. All of that stuff is at jbrownyoga.com. Maybe you would like to show a bit of support for the podcast. Good way to do that would be to go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation. That is very helpful. You could also go to iTunes, write a review, give us some stars. Haven't had any of those in a while. Maybe you would hook me up. Mostly, though, just very grateful to you that you would spend some time in your life listening to this. And I am going to hit you up on the other side, let you know more about who's coming on next week. But for now, I think that's enough. Let's get to it. Let's sit down and have this talk with Justine from Down Under Yoga in Boston.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you today?
I'm good.
So fun to have a talk with you.
Yeah, I'm really glad. I'm glad we connect. And you can hear me fine?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me all right?
I'm good. Although, I don't know if you know, I'm completely technologically inept. So if anything, if I hit a wrong button, you'll give me a pass.
Of course, but I think we're good to go. Everything looks okay on my side. Are you all settled in? And do you need like to get any water, go to the bathroom or anything?
No, although I should warn you, I'm 6 months pregnant, so depending on how long we go, I make a mistake. I'm off to pee. So.
Oh my gosh, well, please. I understand how that is. I've got 2 little ones myself. I know how it is. So you'll let me know if you need to take a break for a second or something.
I will. And there is also a 1-year-old in the background, but he is playing very, very happily, and he has a babysitter. So those are the only caveats.
Oh, I love it. You see, we're in the midst of householder yogi life.
Exactly. How old are your kids?
I've got a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old.
Oh, that's lovely.
But I have to say, they went with their mother to their in-laws for the holiday, and I stayed back. So I'm kind of having some unusual solo bachelor time, and you know that's rare as a parent.
Believe me, I love it.
And I'd say it's even more rare for the moms than the dads, frankly.
I know my oldest just went to summer camp, so I'm torn between a feeling of mourning and the fact that there are only 3 children now to govern. So.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I want to just say thanks because, I posted that post on Facebook with the article in the Yoga Journal with a pretty snarky comment. It was pretty punky of me.
I think that's gracious of you.
Well, it was. And, I don't always do that. Maybe I was in a mood that day. I don't know. But I just really appreciated how you jumped on and made a comment and agreed to have this talk with me. I just think that's the kind of thing that I'm kind of looking for, I guess, when I do that. But It doesn't always happen that way, So I was glad that it turned out okay and that you were willing to talk. So thanks for that.
Well, thank you for having me. And we are not only all about the dialogue, but it's actually something I'm super passionate about, which is, I said to you earlier, I'm technologically inept, which just means I don't have Facebook or do a lot of time on social media. But it is one of my pet peeves, actually, is, sort of yoga studio owners, whoever sent you that in Boston, I just think it's so important that we're talking directly because one of the things that most undermines, I think, the attempt of the dialogue that from your website it looks like you're trying to have, which is to sort of open up these really difficult, complex problems that we're all trying to solve. It's definitely my pet peeve when people don't know about us but love to chat about us. We are one of the more talked about things on social media.
Well,
my team is in awe because this is the first podcast I've ever gone on, and it's the first time I've actually ever gone public with talking a little bit about this stuff, because I do tend to be like in our own bubble, and we're working on the stuff that we think is important, but we're so excited to be hearing from other people. So thanks for not just writing the snarky comment, but being willing to follow it up with real conversation, because that's
the whole point of this podcast. And, it's funny, it makes me think, just recently I recorded a talk with Adrienne Mishler. I don't know if you know who she is. She's Yoga with Adrienne. She has like a YouTube channel with over 2 million subscribers.
Yep.
And we were just having a conversation about like the kind of communications you can have online, and how they just tend to be too black and white when things are more nuanced than that. And it seems like that's what you're pointing to. And that's why I like to do these talks, because we can sit down and like have more nuance and not such a black and white thing online,
Agreed. And again, Yoga Journal, God bless them, like really appreciate the coverage. But of course, you're picking one element of what is a much larger picture, and a more complex. So like, we're thrilled that they chose to cover the particular independent contractor versus employee bit. But, as you and I commented, that for us is like one tiny piece of the puzzle.
I really appreciate you just saying that, because I know what an editorial process is like at the Yoga Journal, and I guess that was why I reacted. I reacted more to the way the article was written than like the content in a way, so, but before we get to that, actually, I kind of want to learn more about the history of Down Under.
Sure.
Because I just know I've been a yoga center owner for the last 10 years. I know what it is to run a place, and you guys have been a staple in Boston for a long time. And I think that the choices you're making now that the Yoga Journal was reporting on, they didn't happen like overnight, like that's like a process that leads up to the kind of choices that yoga centers make and why,
Yep.
So hearing some about that, I think, would be informative.
Sure.
And, even first of all, I want to hear about the origins of the center, because, I looked at your bio.
Yep.
And like a couple things popped right out. I was like, whoa. First of all, that your parents taught English to Tibetan monks in the Dalai Lama complex. Because, I did that. For one,
you did?
I traveled to India one time in my life in 1998, and I spent like a week in Dharamsala, and I had a lot of interactions with monks, and I didn't teach like formal English lessons, but I worked with them on their English, and I helped one of them who was trying to do this translation, but I immediately flashed to that. So how old were you when your parents took you there and were teaching English to Tibetan monks?
So that was before I was born. So my parents are both journalists. My mum, I'll give you the brief chapter, but my mum born in a concentration camp, a Japanese concentration camp in Shanghai. They ended up making a film about it called Empire of the Sun. But she became fascinated with all things Chinese and Asian from growing up there. They moved to Africa. My father was a reporter who was sort of kicked out of Africa during apartheid times, went to Fleet Street in England. They met, went traveling, ended up as part of like a long sojourn in Dharamsala, which is, of course, where the Dalai Lama's community fled from China, taught English to Tibetan monks there. My mum's continued, actually. She's a pretty prolific writer, to write on all sorts of historical and political issues connected with that. So, in fact, my introduction to yoga was a very resentful one because it's always been in my family, and I was like, oh, God, this is so boring, being dragged to my mother's various yoga classes. And I remember in high school doing it and just, at that point, it sounds super dramatic to say, I think you need to suffer a little bit to be able to appreciate yoga, but you need to have at least lived a bit to like understand why it could be of benefit.
Well, also, I'm sorry to jump in, but it makes me think, I know also just kids have a way of like wanting to do their own, like my 7-year-old already like she's like doesn't want to have anything to do with yoga because she knows I'm into it. You know what I mean? So like,
exactly.
you probably there's like a gut reaction when your parents are already minded that way that you want to go a different direction.
Right. So I'm not sure I was, fully appreciative of its benefits till later on. But yeah, I did travel through India and went to that community with my mother and met all the people that actually it's extraordinary. They're still there doing this incredibly noble work, and he's remarkable. And India itself was a mind trip because at this point I actually had started doing yoga.
Mm-hmm. So how old are we talking now when you're going there with your mom?
Well, so I met up with my mum. Australians, we do this thing called walkabout. So we go to college, and then if you grow up in Australia, you have the sense that, like, everything's happening somewhere else in the world, right? So you either stay in Australia and the blinkers go on, or you go walkabout. So after I finished a university degree and went walkabout, mm-hmm. and so I ended up going through Europe, which is totally amazing, and then going through India. And I was going to actually live there for about 6 months, and I met a lot of Aussies when I was there. It seemed like Aussies and Israelis. Yeah. Like Israelis get the money when they graduate and they go to India, and then the Aussies go and walkabout. And I want you to know, I saw the movie. There's a movie called Walkabout, and I adopted that term when I decided to take that trip. I was like, I'm going on walkabout, and I had to explain to everybody what it meant. But yeah. And of course, I said to my mother, see you in a year. But of course, then you meet an American, and you end up living in a city that snows 4 months of the year, and you can't understand how you got there. But anyway, until I actually ended up getting crazy sick in India. But before that, India was fascinating because it's such a mind flip. Like at that point, I'd spent so much of my life cultivating my brain. I feel like in the West, we're so in love with the mind, right? And then you go to India, and it's like everything's flipped. So, like, you get on a train that you think's headed to, like, Mumbai, but actually halfway through they tell you there's a detour and you're going to end up somewhere else. And there's this, like, crazy chaos that, like, challenges everything that you understand to equate to order. And yet rising through that chaos is this just unbelievable sort of spirituality, these sadhus clothed in gold walking the length of India barefoot, like that's what they do. Mm-hmm. And there was some, like, I didn't have the quintessential experience of, falling in love with an ashram. I found the ashrams pretty interesting, but also complicated. The first ashram we went to, there were some Indian people outside who were just so fascinated to know what was going on inside. And, the dichotomy between, well, there's drinking water and fresh fruit inside the ashram, but outside there's sort of layers of poverty that are just mind-blowing. Mm-hmm. And it was also very fascinating to me. I got really, really sick there, and they forgot my blood. My blood went back into an IV, and I got this, shake stuff. And, there was a point at which I'm like, Jesus, am I going to die here in India?
Oh, shit.
This mindset of like, wait, I'm 22. Like, this isn't my story. I get out to the West and I go on living my life, And yet all around you is just like crazy poverty and death, and actually an approach to death that is so very different to how we think of things in the West. So it was the Dalai Lama's the sort of work. I met up with my mother and sort of saw her work in Dharamsala, but the major impact for me was just beginning to really understand yoga as it was taught in all its different roots there, and just having an appreciation for that country.
Well, I had a very similar experience. I've talked about this somewhere. Like the first week, I was just miserable because, like, that chaos factor that you talk about, it's incredibly unsettling. I had never even traveled from America before,
right?
But kind of there was a point at which you kind of surrender over to it,
right?
And that surrender was incredibly transformative. It was kind of coming up against this void, like, oh, we could die here. Like my friend and I still have it. We wrote this note because at one point we hit like a sketchy place, like off of the tourist track, and we wrote like a note said, if I die here, I want my friend to have me cremated and to finish the trip with like we like wrote this thing and both signed it, like it was like life or death. And then coming up against that, I really feel like I did learn so much about yoga, but not from going to an ashram, just like you. Like I didn't want to stay at the ashram, but like just being there in that different relationship to time and that different relationship to death, as you put it too, was really deeply transformative and like pointed me to yoga in new ways.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I'm not sure I ever really relate to, like, when people are like, oh, I just love India. I'm like, really?
Yeah, it's hard. It's rough, man. It's rough travel.
Like, it's not one-dimensional for you.
It's not Costa Rica on the beach retreat shit, you know?
Right. And now I'm a mother. I shudder to think of, like, had I had, I don't know, there's probably decent travel insurance you could have gotten, which would have gotten you to a different hospital. But I was definitely like the abandoned drips and needles on the floor of the hospital.
Yeah, I remember I had like saved up this money and I was like going so bargain basement. But after like, we were there for 3 months, but after the first month, I realized how little money I was spending on everything. I was like, shit, I can throw down $100 and get someone to drive me anywhere I want to go. You know what I mean? Like, you can throw money around in India, but anyways, all right, so
anyway, fast forward. I mean, I'm actually a very unlikely studio owner. I was never.
Wait a second, because I know you just talk about this transformative experience in India, but you didn't like come back and become a yoga teacher. You like became a lawyer. So how does that happen?
Well, okay, so after my experience in India, I was like, all right, I wanted to keep traveling, but I didn't want to go home. So I'm like, I had, my first degree was in Shakespeare, but I had done half of a law degree, because in Australia, you know, you go straight in from school, but I was like, I had gone halfway through. So I was like, well, how can I keep traveling, see the world, but like maybe take a break from, you know, my body was still getting better after India. So I decided to enroll in third year of law school in Vancouver. I'm like, well, I'll probably hate it, but, you know, it'll be a new place. And I was unprepared for how much I loved law school in Vancouver. It was well, over here, it's like a graduate degree. So instead of like a bunch of 17-year-olds whose, you know, parents have suggested they do the honourable thing and go to med school or law school, this was everyone had done something with their lives. So there were sort of pretty extraordinary people doing law degrees for a whole variety of reasons. And I ended up studying under an amazing woman called Marcia Cran, who worked with judges and lawyers in third world countries trying to establish like international human rights standards as part of their legal code. So fast forward was for several years after I worked ended up going to the UN and having an experience there, sort of learning more about that. And then we ended up creating something called the Youth Millennium Project, which was really just designed to go through 2000. And it got kids in different countries of the world to work on a global issue that was important to them. So kids in Vietnam got chicks, sold the eggs at the local market, used that to get school supplies because education was their focus. They were communicating with kids in Rwanda whose focus was an end to conflict, communicating with kids in a different country who were focusing on clean water. And so it was intended to be a sort of an empowering experience where children were supported in being able to have an idea, take an idea through execution, and be in contact with other children in other countries who were working on similar ideas. And so it was both a sharing of experience but also a cultural exchange. And again, through this work, I was really fortunate to be put in touch with one of the heads of UNICEF, and UNICEF very kindly offered to use their field offices. So anyway, short story.
Well, what was your role in that? As you got your law degree and then you started doing this work for international human rights. What was you actually doing? What was your role?
We created the project. It was me and my best friend, an American girl who I met in Greece, and we had a law professor who had worked in the Trudeau government. We took him this idea, we pitched it. So I guess I do have a history of entrepreneurial ideas, but it just hasn't always been in yoga.
Yeah,
so
that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's what I'm going to get at, because not all yoga teachers have that streak in them.
Right, and like I'm clearly raised by two journalist parents who like all they ever talked about is like how you're going to contribute to the world. So this was my sort of earlier execution of that, and we went to him and said, we've got this idea, will you give us an office in the law school, and will you help us figure out? And my friend was an amazing translator, speaks a bunch of different languages. So we got this document translated into, 50 different languages, and then managed to convince UNICEF to be our field office. So I think we ended up having tens of thousands of kids in 80 different countries because UNICEF liked the concept. And the project became so successful that I believe it continues in some form today. But I hadn't intended it to be anything other than a one-year project. So then it became more, my role initially was the creator of it. And then as it became successful and we attempted to continue it, I found myself more in a fundraising role, which I do not enjoy.
Asking people for money isn't quite the same thing as seeing the children get their help, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And that coincided with the time that I started dating an American who I met in Oxford during these travels. And he was like, come to DC, see how it is. And of course I thought, well, that'll never work out, but it'll be good for a year. And so I decided to really make a yoga year. And that's where I was surprised that, first of all, I loved DC. I was imagining like New York skyscrapers. Instead, I found myself in this beautiful city next to Rock Creek Park and able to run. And there was a little Iyengar yoga center that I immediately joined, John Schumacher, a tiny little hole in the wall near Adams Morgan in DC.
So did you just get like totally burnt out and you're like, I got to leave and go do yoga? That's how it went?
No, it was more of a, I hate to be old school, it was more of a romantic adventure. I was into doing the work I was doing, but I was also like ready for a change. And I don't think I really expected it to go in the way it is. I figured, the first day I got there and I moved into my boyfriend's flat, and he arranged all the tall glasses on the left, the middle glasses in the middle, and the small glasses on the right-hand side. And I came from, living in crunchy granola. As you said, even my socks were from recycled vintage stores.
Yeah.
So we could not have had a greater clash, the barefoot Australian yogi with, New York.
But isn't that a lovely contrast?
Yeah, and to my surprise, that worked out. And what was crazy was I absolutely loved teaching yoga. And the fascinating thing was, my experience with the law project, I had this sense of doing good. I mean, we were doing great work. I went to bed at night and did not feel morally ambiguous about anything I had done, which is something my husband and I both share as key principles of the work we do. But in the yoga room, the fascinating thing was I got more of a palpable sense of doing good than I had ever had. And it was only with like 15, 20 people, but you could almost feel the effect that you'd had on someone's day. And I was unprepared for how each class would become a community in and of itself. I mean, the first year of teaching yoga just sucks.
But wait, let's get to how you got to be a teacher. So when you got there, you weren't already teaching, were you?
Correct.
I mean, you had practiced yoga in your life.
Yep, I had practiced for a long time, and I did a teacher training with a little studio called Bagheera Yoga, which was two teachers, one of whom was 40-something, and the other of whom was a senior teacher, Prue Kessner, who was she was probably 75 at the time, and part of having, that avant-garde who brought yoga from east to west.
Was that before you went to John Shoemaker's place?
No, I was also studying at John Schumacher. And actually, now, many, many years later, I'll tell my trainees that it's so important in developing your own voice to have different voices in your head. So I had to go on a wait list. I cleaned the studio at John Schumacher's for a long time because you couldn't get into study with him. And this is with some of the registration series in the Iyengar school that became part of Down Under. I definitely owe to that. So I was cleaning their toilets and just hoping one day to get into John Schumacher's class. And then I did. I had done my teacher training with Prue and Bobby, and I got this letter saying, all right, you're in. And I walked into my first class, and we were doing Virabhadrasana too. And he said, okay, change sides. So I dropped my hands, looked at my feet, repositioned. And he was like, hey, new girl, if you want to stay in this class, don't drop your hands until I say so.
Whoa, boom.
Oh my God, John Schumacher's an ass. And I went home to my husband and I was like, I waited all this time.
Well, but that's sort of more to the method. I mean, that's more to how Iyengar taught. We've talked about that on this podcast many times. People who studied old school Iyengar and how they emulated their teacher, but as time's gone on, that's become less and less kind of kosher in a way.
Well, what's really interesting is, so first of all, my husband was like, go back next week. And I did, and I went back the week after. And what I came to see through that strictness, I mean, everyone has a very special love for their first yoga teacher. Mm-hmm. And to this day, if he'll come up and do a conference, and I'll go with Nadia and all my other Iyengar friends, and I'm usually the one weeping within about 30 seconds of class, just because being back in the presence of your first teacher is always a very special thing. But John Schumacher happens to be one of the most brilliant Iyengar teachers, but actually one of the most honest and daring advocates for the Iyengar methodology to embrace other methods. And in fact, my vision for Down Under was very influenced by a talk that he gave at the Iyengar convention, where I hope he'll forgive me for paraphrasing, but in code it said it's just so essential to maintain the rigor of the Iyengar method and its genius, but to begin to branch out and accept other styles and learn from other methodologies. And that speech really kind of crystallized for me my vision for Down Under, because I did another teacher training, which was Patricia Walden and Peens Dubel's 2-year Iyengar training, which frankly made law school look like child's play. Like, I'm not sure I just cried in Patricia's 2-hour Sanskrit exams.
Yeah, wow.
At that point, I had just had my first child, who, of course, is now 11. And a strange thing happened to me, which was from being a pretty serious Iyengar practitioner. I found that all of a sudden I no longer wanted to stay in a pose, and I no longer had an hour and a half practice time, and I really needed to move, because as you would know, having an infant is so physically exhausting that by the end of the day you maybe have 35 minutes before you completely tank. And so I actually began to fall in love with the Surya Namaskars and get interested in vinyasa. So my entire vision for Down Under has been kind of a vision of a creative home where both the student is free to explore every style as curiosity dictates, but also where every teacher is free. So it was sort of a very strange concept to me that there would be a studio where, in the beginning of Down Under, we used to have some students come and sort of tattletale on, say, the heated flow teacher, because they weren't teaching the exact sequence. And I'd say, isn't that exciting? Like, where do you think they're going to go? These different voices. I definitely have Prue Kessner, who was one of my first teachers and would walk around, and when I was in handstand or headstand would come up and say, oh, beautiful, Justine, beautiful. And
nice.
I definitely have
that's a nice contrast to John telling you not to take your arms down,
Yeah, and you know what? You need both, because every 2 years some jerk walks into your class who's determined to challenge you in front of people. Or I once had a guy who, in the middle of Shavasana, having not listened to a single thing I said, stood up and began wildly gesticulating around the room. And I walked up to him and I said, so what are you doing? And he said, oh, this is my Shavasana. And I said, oh, not in this class, it isn't. Sit down.
That was well done. Not in this class.
You need a John Schumacher voice, but you also need Prue Kessner voice, so that you can bring people to their edge, but also cradle them there.
Okay, so you finish teacher trainings, you start teaching. Where do you teach? Where's
the
first
church, Newton Highlands, little stone church.
And you got a church basement.
Yep.
Okay.
Reverend walking
See,
through.
that's real old school. That's real old school.
Yeah. And I mean, so much when I say I'm an unlikely studio owner, like I grabbed the 3 great people from Patricia's training who I was like, okay, you can teach. And I said, let's just teach our hearts out. And that's really what we did for the first 5 years. And it blossomed into this much bigger than yoga in the sense that, like, we'd have potlucks at each other's houses. And there are such fascinating people living here. Like one of the little potlucks, the guy who, we knew he worked in Iraq at the time. We didn't know that his entire job was, trying to reinvigorate like the agrarian economy and, seeing pictures. It was the first time some of us had even really seen pictures of like what life was like in Iraq at this time. And you had musicians and artists and writers. So from day one, it was a really special community. It was a very unpretentious. We all signed in on little note cards. It was an honor system.
So let me ask another question then. So going from a church basement to getting a lease on a space.
Yeah.
That's a leap. I made that leap too.
Yep.
When you did that though, that was just you, right? You didn't have
No, it was out
partners.
of necessity. No, well, not partners. It's always just been me in the sense of, if you're asking, whose house was on the line.
That's what I'm saying. Because I say that because, like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm having a talk with a teacher like tomorrow who emailed me about like all these gripes she has with yoga center owners, and some of them are legit, but like some of them are just like not really understanding like the back end of what actually needs to happen for a yoga center to run. So I know that I had opportunities to like partner or collaborate on a center earlier that I did not take because I didn't feel confident that the collaboration could withstand the stresses, and ultimately opted to just kind of fly solo. Surely there was lots of other people I was bringing in, but in the end, like you said, my skin was in the game in a way that other people's wasn't.
Right. And I can't really take credit for that because the truth is I probably would have taken partners or anyone who had any kind of background. And we had a couple of people kind of come to us in the beginning. It came about because the church was like, dude, we're a church, and like you're in Saturday mornings, now you want Sundays, like it's time for you to go be a yoga center, because we were growing. And this was just at this point the Iyengar teachers, we had a kids yoga teacher, so it was like 4 of us. And my husband was the one that was like, let's not do partners, let's see if we can make this work. But again, remember, we weren't really setting out to create a yoga studio. We were like, I love teaching yoga. I have 2 little kids at this point. We needed to look for a space. And the way it happened, again, I'm always sort of disappointing when these business yoga panels invite me to speak because they think I'm going to share some brilliant, MBA in business strategy where I managed to convince all these famous American yoga teachers to come under one roof. And it's actually quite the opposite of that, which is, we were all trained by Peens and Patricia. So as we found our Newton space, it's courtesy to go to your senior teacher and say, in whatever way we can support you, we'd love to. Please feel free to come teach workshops or whatever, or have a cup of tea if you want to learn more. And of course, Peens, who's Patricia's other trainer, said, "Oh, I'd love to have a cup of tea." At which point I went back to the other Iyengar teachers and was like, "Shit, Peens actually wants to have tea. What should we do?"
Yeah.
So it was a lovely thing in that she ended up moving her community, which had existed for decades, into the space, and that was where we created. We had a little kind of panel about. What we wanted the space to be. And again, this is it became the beginning of people commenting on us. It was not intended actually to be a definitive proclamation on what yoga studios should be. It was really for to chart our own course, because we went around Boston and, again, no judgment, every single studio does what it is meant to do really well, right? Like, the Baptiste model was meant to produce profit, and it did that really, really well. And the teachers are deliberately designed to be in some ways replaceable, right? Because it's like one method. Or we saw a lot of different studios where there was chaos, very dramatic fallings out. That was the point at which, you know, Darren had inspired Rolf, or the sort of the backbiting and sort of dramatic fallings out between studio owners and teachers. And this is really informative for you to understand my vision, because I honestly felt like if I was involved in anything that approximated that, I felt like my whole life would be a waste of time. Like, it's a decade later and those students are still disillusioned from the fallouts. Like, I
had a talk with Julie Buckner from In Yoga in Los Angeles, pretty big, over $1 million gross every year, and she ended up closing down after a long time. But I had a conversation with her about this too, because, you know, you and her both have run your centers more like a business than I have, in a sense. Not in a bad sense, but in a good sense, in a like structural sense. Like, some of that chaos that you're talking about usually happens just because it's like there's the neuroses of the one person at the top who's basically doing too much and is trying to do the work of like 5 people.
Exactly.
And so things fall through the cracks, and then communications get weird, and then people don't always handle things well, and then all that crap happens.
Right.
But the idea is, if you set up more of like a solid business structure, then you can alleviate some of that. Just seems
I don't know, Dallin. I wish I could tell you I had done that, but that actually is not the reality of how we started. I mean, the reality was I learned that by trial by fire.
Yeah.
So we started in this place, Pins moved in, and I had 2 managers, me and another teacher. And we were like, 2 managers and like some volunteers, we can run this place. Well, first of all, we lived that life for the first like 3-4 years, where nobody had a weekend. Within the first year,
you're with your family, and you get the text. You need the sub. Right? It's all on you. Totally
miserable, and that's where I actually, from the inside out, like, I didn't have the experience, nor do I have, frankly, the interest in business. I mean, it sort of a little bit pisses me off when people are like, "Oh, you're a corporate model," and I'm like, "Tell me about that," because, like, in order to do our second studio, Jeff and I put our house on the line. Like, the stress of that nearly killed me. So for us, we opened Newton because we kind of fell into it in the terms of we wanted a place for teaching and learning. We did hold this sort of, all our senior teachers were invited. So, you know, at this point, Natasha and Barbara Boehner were just doing workshops, but we invited them to this panel and we said, you know, what kind of a space do we want to create? And that's where the vision of...
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.